Hello, everyone. It's great to be back with you after this Easter week. We're continuing on in this resurrection theme this week by looking at John chapter 29, verses 19 to 31. And this passage is really cool because it talks about some of the aftermath of the resurrection. And as I was reading this passage, one of the things that I kept thinking about when I was reading it was that I really appreciated this inside look at what happened after the resurrection. Jesus rose from the dead, he was crucified, but he didn't just leave right away. He was able to meet with his closest friends and actually spend some time with them afterwards. And the wisdom that Jesus gives us in this time with his disciples are like golden nuggets. They're so special to read through and reflect on. And I believe that it can be so beneficial for us today even. So here we are. We meet with the disciples and they're hiding out in a locked room because they know what just happened, that Jesus was crucified and he rose again. And they're kind of afraid of what might happen with the Jewish leaders. But the great thing is that a locked door doesn't stop Jesus. Suddenly, Jesus is there with his disciples in the room, and he wants to make himself known to his disciples. So Jesus is there, and he begins to show the disciples all that had happened to him. And he actually starts to physically show the wounds in his hands and the nails from the nails and the mark on his side where the guards stabbed him with the spear. And what a sight that must have been, to see your closest friend back with you again after you witnessed such horrific acts against him. But he's back and he's standing in the room with the disciples and he is happy to be there with them. And of course, Jesus, in the most wonderful way, he doesn't just show up empty-handed. He actually brings them a gift. He says this in verse 21, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." Then he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." Jesus knows that his time on earth with the disciples is actually pretty limited. He also knows that he's about to commission the disciples to go out in the world and work on a mission to tell the world about Jesus. And he doesn't just want to leave them alone and ill-equipped. So he brings them the ultimate gift of the Holy Spirit, who will be there as a guide for them after Jesus returns to be with his Father in heaven. And I really love this description. Jesus is telling his disciples that he's not just going to leave them alone to wander around and kind of figure out what to do by themselves, but instead, he's going to give them exactly what they need to tackle whatever challenge might come their way. And that's by giving them the Holy Spirit. This is actually still true for us today. I want you to know that. We actually get to have this gift as well. It's not just for the disciples. We have access to the Holy Spirit who is with us when we ask to receive him. The Holy Spirit was not just given as a guide for the disciples, but is available to be a guide for us as well. This is the first part of the passage that I want you to remember. Jesus doesn't just send us to tackle challenges without being equipped for us, but that the Holy Spirit is here for us to access and use and help us as we go and tackle whatever life brings us. How amazing is that the gift that we read isn't just for them in the history, but it's actually for us today. And the second thing that I want to highlight in this passage is this. Not all of Jesus's disciples were actually with him that day when he appeared to them. In verse 24, we read that Thomas wasn't with the disciples and never actually got to see Jesus. So the other disciples come running to him and they say, "Hey, guess who we've just seen? We've seen Jesus." And Thomas has a response that a lot of us would actually have if we really thought about it. He says, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand in his side, I will not believe." And I'm sure if you thought about it for a second, you would also have this reaction if your friends came running up to you and said, "Hey, we've just seen Jesus and you haven't." Then a week later, Thomas and all of the other disciples are together. They're in that room again, and they see Jesus again. This time, Jesus makes sure to purposely talk to Thomas, and he wants to make sure that Thomas believes that it is him. So he instructs Thomas to put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. As soon as this happens, Thomas believes that who he sees in front of him is Jesus. Faith would be easy if we could see Jesus in front of us and believe. Then we would fully know who we are believing in. It makes sense. But faith isn't about seeing everything in front of us. In Hebrews 11 verse 1 in the NLT version, it says, "Faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things we cannot see." Faith is not meant to be present when we can see everything in front of us. Faith is so much larger than that. And Jesus wanted Thomas to learn this lesson. He knew that he needed to tell Thomas that faith should not be built on his ability to see the nail-scarred hands or the wound in his side. In fact, Jesus says that those who believe but haven't seen yet, they will be best. Faith is scary. It's actually a really large ask of someone to believe in a God that we don't always get to see or hear all the time. But just because you don't physically see or audibly hear from God doesn't mean that he's not always there. God's presence is all around us, and he shows up in so many ways for us. So this week, I want us to take on a challenge together. I want you to start to think of ways where you have seen God work. At the end of our passage, it says that this book of John that we're reading from was written for us, that the stories were written down for us so that we may believe and that we would have life in his name because of it. Taking time to acknowledge how God has shown up, where he's worked in your life, or how he has spoken to you is actually a fantastic way to increase our faith. And it's something that helps us greatly in those moments where faith kind of feels like a really big stretch. Having these reminders, like the stories that are written in the book of John, can help us feel renewed and refreshed. We're now a week off of Easter, and for many of us, we've been either reminded or maybe we've actually just heard for the first time of the incredible sacrifice that Jesus made for us. Take time to thank God for this sacrifice. The disciples, after all the events of the crucifixion and the resurrection, they actually hid in a locked room, afraid of what the Jewish leaders might say or might do. But that's not the kind of power and boldness that the resurrection left us. What the resurrection did was that it gave us the power to be bold in our faith and live our life for Jesus, one that is full and one that is wonderful. The Holy Spirit is there to be our guide as we walk through life and equips us to live the life that Jesus has called us to. So I want you to think about that this week. I want you to think about it as you write down the stories of how God has been faithful to you. Write them down and have them be a reminder that God is always with us. He doesn't leave us alone. And when he's about to go and return to be with his Father in heaven, he gave his disciples such a great gift that we still have access to. Have a great week.